we were talking about the possibility of 3 different crime
scene
scenes.
was heartbreaking. 8 victims, all
shot as they lay in bed, one with her 4-day-old baby nearby.
In the quiet back roads of Pike County, Ohio, where rolling fields met thick stands of forest and the nights were so still you could hear the wind shifting through the trees, the Rhoden family lived lives that were, in many ways, quintessentially rural. They worked hard, kept mostly to themselves, and centered their world around kin. Their homes, some modest trailers, others small houses, were scattered across a few properties that weren't far apart by country standards. It was a place where you could walk between them in minutes, where family dropped by without calling, and where doors were often left unlocked. The Rhodens were large in number, close-knit, and bound by the rhythms of work, hunting, and raising children. Chris Rhoden Sr., the patriarch in spirit if not always in age, had a reputation as someone you could rely on. He knew his way around an engine, could fix most things with his hands, and had an easy way of making people feel welcome. His brother, Kenneth Rhoden, was cut from the same cloth, plain-spoken, loyal, the sort of man who looked after his own. There was Frankie Rhoden, Chris's son, who was still in his early 20s but already a devoted father to his little boy. He and his fiancée, Hannah Gilley, were building their life together, navigating the struggles of young adulthood with the fierce determination of people who love their family more than anything. Frankie's younger sister, Hannah Rhoden, was still a teenager, bright-eyed and devoted to her own baby girl, Kinsey. She was known for her quick smile and her love for animals, a girl whose whole future seemed stretched out ahead of her. The family's social circle was tight, as is common in rural Ohio, where everybody knows everybody's business. That closeness could be both a comfort and a curse. Good news traveled fast, but so did rumors. In the months leading up to April 2016, there had been whispers of tensions between the Rhodens and another local family, the Wagners. The Wagners were also well known in the county, and their lives had become entwined with the Rhodens through the relationship between Jake Wagner and Hannah Rhoden, which had produced a daughter. Custody arrangements, especially in small communities, can be deeply personal and fiercely fought over. There had been disagreements, and to those paying close enough attention, a sense of unease in the air. But in rural life, disputes like that were often chalked up to family drama, the kind that burned hot for a while and then simmered down without ever making the evening news. No one in the Rhoden family could have imagined just how far and how dark that conflict would go. The day before the massacre was unremarkable on the surface. The weather was cool but not cold, spring beginning to soften the edges of winter. People went about their business, working shifts, taking care of children, running errands. That night, as darkness settled over the county, the rural landscape went quiet as it always did. Homes were lit from within, their occupants winding down for the night. But in the early hours of April 22, 2016, that peace was shattered in a way that would leave the entire community reeling. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, in 4 separate homes, members of the Rhoden family were executed, shot in their sleep, in their beds, without warning. At Chris Rhoden Sr.'s home, he was found dead along with his cousin Gary Rhoden, both killed with precision shots. Across town, at Frankie's home, Frankie and Hannah Gilley were discovered, their bodies lying in bed, the blankets still pulled over them. In another residence, Clarence Chris Rhoden Jr. was found, along with his cousin Dana Manley Rhoden. In a 4th home, Kenneth Rhoden lay dead from a single gunshot wound. In all, 8 members of the family were killed, most of them in their sleep. 3 small children were found alive at the scenes, spared, though no one knew exactly why. One was a newborn baby, still lying beside her mother's lifeless body. Another was Frankie's toddler son, wandering the house in the aftermath. The third, just a few months old, had been left unharmed in the chaos. The brutality and precision of the killings stunned law enforcement. This wasn't a drunken fight that had spiraled out of control or a random act of violence. It was targeted, methodical, and carried out with chilling efficiency. Whoever had done this had moved through multiple homes in the dead of night without alerting neighbors, without leaving behind signs of a struggle, and without harming the children. Pike County Sheriff Charles Reeder, a man not easily rattled, told the press in the first chaotic hours that this was unlike anything his department had ever faced. The crime scenes were sprawling and complex, each requiring careful processing. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the FBI, and multiple neighboring law enforcement agencies descended on the area to assist. In those early hours, rumors ran wild. Some speculated about drug activity, noting that marijuana plants had been found at some of the properties. Others whispered about old feuds and grudges. But beneath the gossip was a common thread of fear that the killers were still out there, that they might strike again. The funerals for the Rhoden family were massive, drawing people from across the county and beyond. Rows of mourners lined up to pay their respects, many still in disbelief that something so brutal could have happened in their own backyard. In small towns, tragedy often feels personal, even if you didn't know the victims, because the distance between them and us is so small that the days turned into weeks. Law enforcement combed through hundreds of tips, interviewed dozens of people, and chased leads that stretched far beyond Pike County. The initial public statements from officials were careful, but it was clear they believed the Rhodens had been targeted. Sheriff Reeder urged the surviving family members to arm themselves, a startling recommendation that underscored the danger and uncertainty hanging over the case. In the midst of the grief, life went on in small, stubborn ways. The children who had been spared were cared for by relatives. Neighbors kept watch on each other's homes. But under the surface, the question of who had done this and why not at everyone. It would take more than 2 years for the truth to emerge, and when it did, it would expose a plot so twisted and so cold that even seasoned investigators were stunned. The roots of the massacre reached deep into the soil of family ties, jealousy, and control, ties that, in the end, had been severed by gunfire in the dark. The investigation into the Pike County massacre became one of the largest criminal probes in Ohio's history, and from the very beginning, detectives knew they were dealing with something extraordinary. It wasn't just the sheer number of victims. 8 people, all connected by blood or close ties, killed in a coordinated strike. It was the way the murders had been carried out. Execution style. No signs of forced entry at some locations. Multiple scenes hit in one night without alerting neighbors. And most chilling of all, the killers had spared the children. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation set up a command center to handle the case, drawing in experts from across the state. Agents in plain clothes went door to door in Pike County, asking residents what they had seen or heard that night. They canvassed local stores for security footage, combed through hours of video from gas stations, convenience stores, and traffic cameras. They also brought in canine units to track potential scent trails, though by the time the crime scenes were discovered, any trails had long gone cold. The crime scene processing was painstaking. Every shell casing, every footprint, every stray fiber was collected, but the killers had been meticulous. They had left no obvious fingerprints, no DNA, no cigarette butts or soda cans, nothing that would hand law enforcement an easy answer. The scenes were eerily clean for such a violent crime. From the start, Sheriff Charles Reeder and Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine, later to become governor, made it clear that they believed the Rhodens had been targeted. This wasn't random. It wasn't a break-in gone wrong. The killers had known exactly who they were coming for and where to find them. That belief narrowed the scope of the investigation in one way, but made it infinitely more complicated in another, because it meant the killers were likely from within the victim's social or family orbit. In a rural community like Pike County, that web was vast. Detectives dug deep into the Rhodens' personal lives. They learned about disputes over property, rumors of marijuana growing operations, and, most significantly, tensions surrounding the custody of a little girl, Sophia, the daughter of Jake Wagner and Hannah Rhoden. The custody dispute had been simmering for some time. Jake and Hannah's relationship had ended, and though they shared a child, their visions for her upbringing had diverged sharply. There were arguments about visitation, about schooling, about who would have the final say in important decisions. Those close to the situation said it was bitter enough to cause lasting resentment. Still, the idea that a custody dispute could escalate into mass murder seemed almost too monstrous to be real. Yet as the investigation dragged on, the Wagner family kept coming up in whispers. Jake Wagner, his brother George Wagner IV, and their parents, Angela and George Billy Wagner III, were all part of the tight-knit clan that had once been close to the Rhodens. They lived on their own farm, somewhat isolated from the rest of the community, and were known to keep to themselves. In the months after the murders, the Wagners sold their farm and moved to Alaska. On the surface, the move was presented as a fresh start, but for investigators, it raised eyebrows. It looked like distance, both literal and figurative, from the epicenter of the investigation. Even from across the continent, however, the Wagners could not escape the scrutiny of Ohio law enforcement. Investigators quietly began piecing together a timeline that suggested not only motive but opportunity. They examined the Wagners' phone records, financial transactions, and travel patterns. They searched storage units and retrieved old surveillance footage from months before the murders. They began to suspect that the killings had been planned far in advance, meticulously, even obsessively. A major break came when investigators obtained a search warrant for the Wagners' property and vehicles before they left Ohio. They found homemade silencers, devices designed to muffle the sound of gunfire. They also uncovered evidence of forged documents related to custody, suggesting the family had been prepared to use deceit, not just force, to gain control of Sophia. The picture that began to form was chilling. A family conspiracy to eliminate the Rhodens connected to the custody dispute, carried out with military-like precision. But law enforcement still needed more, something that would stand up in court against what was sure to be an aggressive defense. They turned to an exhaustive process, interviewing hundreds of people connected to both families. Former friends, distant relatives, co-workers, anyone who might have noticed unusual behavior before or after the murders. They tracked down tips from people who claimed to have overheard incriminating conversations or seen suspicious movements on the night of the killings. It took over 2 years of relentless work, but by late 2018, the evidence was strong enough for prosecutors to make their move. On November 13, 2018, in a stunning press conference, Ohio authorities announced the arrests of all 4 members of the Wagner family: Billy, Angela, Jake, and George IV, charging them with 8 counts of aggravated murder, conspiracy, and a slew of related offenses. The arrests sent shockwaves through Pike County. The Wagners, once seen by some as just another quiet farm family, were now accused of plotting and executing one of the deadliest mass killings in Ohio history. The sheer scale of the alleged conspiracy, family members working together to methodically kill another family, was almost incomprehensible. But for the surviving Rhodens, the arrests brought something they hadn't had in over 2 years: the hope of justice. The courtroom revelations in the Pike County Massacre case were the kind of truths that law enforcement had suspected for years but could never publicly confirm until the evidence and confessions lined up when the Wagner family was first charged. In November 2018, prosecutors made it clear they would pursue the death penalty against all 4. That decision was partly strategic. It placed immense pressure on the defendants, especially in a case where multiple family members were accused of acting together. If one of them turned, the state could gain a first-hand account of the planning and execution. The break came in 2021 when Jake Wagner, the youngest son, stood in court and pled guilty to 8 counts of aggravated murder in exchange for the prosecution taking the death penalty off the table for his entire family. His voice was steady but subdued as he admitted, one by one, to killing each member of the Rhoden family. He also confessed to a series of related crimes, including conspiracy, burglary, and tampering with evidence. What stunned the courtroom most was not just his admission, but the chilling reason behind it: custody of his daughter. Jake told the court that he and his family feared losing Sophia to Hannah Rhoden and the Rhoden family. They believed Hannah was raising Sophia in ways they disagreed with, and in their warped logic, the only way to secure custody was to eliminate anyone who might challenge them in court. As part of his plea, Jake laid out the events of that April night in haunting detail. He described how the family had planned the murders for months, studying the Rhodens' routines, preparing homemade silencers for their weapons, and dividing the targets among them. They had chosen the early morning hours because they knew their victims would be asleep. He told the court how he and George IV had gone to one home while his parents targeted others, moving silently through dark rooms, shooting their victims. In bed, most never woke up. The children, they left unharmed, intentionally stepping around cribs and small beds. Jake's words painted a picture of calculated, emotionless killing. Violence committed not in the heat of the moment, but in the cold precision of a plan. His confession corroborated much of the forensic evidence investigators had painstakingly gathered. The use of two different firearms, the matching of homemade suppressors to ballistic markings, the lack of forced entry in some homes because the killers had known exactly how to get inside. After Jake's plea, his mother, Angela Wagner, also struck a deal. In September 2021, she pled guilty to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, tampering with evidence, and other charges. In exchange, she agreed to testify against her husband and older son. Her account filled in more gaps, particularly about the planning stages. Angela told prosecutors that she and Jake had discussed killing Hannah Rhoden as early as 2015, when custody tensions first escalated. She admitted to forging documents and helping plan the logistics of the murders, including the timing, the selection of weapons, and the layout of the attack. She portrayed herself as someone acting to protect her family. But in the eyes of the court, her testimony confirmed her deep involvement in the conspiracy that in 2022, the trial of George Wagner finally began. It became the centerpiece of the state's case, a months-long proceeding in which jurors heard from more than 50 witnesses, including Jake and Angela themselves. For the first time, the public heard every grim detail of the massacre from the mouths of those who had carried it out. Jake, under oath, recounted how he shot Chris Rhoden Sr. and Gary Rhoden, how his brother shot Frankie Rhoden and Hannah Gilley, and how their father killed Dana Rhoden and Kenneth Rhoden. He spoke in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that made the horror somehow more palpable. Angela took the stand and described the preparations, how they had walked the properties in daylight to map their routes, how they had tested their homemade silencers, how they had made lists of every Rhoden they believed could pose a legal threat to Jake's custody of Sophia. She admitted to burning items of clothing afterward and helping destroy evidence. The defense for George IV tried to distance him from the shootings themselves, arguing that he had not pulled the trigger. But prosecutors countered that under Ohio law, active participation in planning and executing a murder spree made him just as culpable as the one holding the gun. Jurors saw photographs from the crime scenes, bedrooms with rumpled blankets and bloodstains, toys lying untouched near where parents had been killed. They listened to wiretaps in which the Wagners spoke cryptically about things being taken care of and not leaving loose ends. They saw the forged custody documents and the receipts for materials used to make the suppressors. When the verdict came in November 2022, George Wagner IV was found guilty on all 22 counts, including 8 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In 2023, the last piece of the case fell into place when Patriarch George Billy Wagner III finally stood trial. Faced with the overwhelming testimony of his own family, he too was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without parole. For the Rhoden family survivors, the convictions brought a measure of closure, but not peace. The children who had been spared that night were now being raised by relatives, growing up with the knowledge of what had happened. The community of Pike County would never forget the night when fear replaced the usual rural stillness, when the trust of neighbor and kin was shattered forever. Even now, years later, the Pike County Massacre stands as a rare and chilling example of familial mass murder, a calculated, cold-blooded operation driven by control, paranoia, and an unthinkable belief that ending lives was a solution to a custody battle. It remains one of the darkest chapters in Ohio's history, a reminder that sometimes the gravest danger comes not from strangers, but from those bound to us by blood. The trials had ended, but in Pike County, the echoes of the massacre lingered everywhere, in whispered conversations at gas stations, in the sidelong glances exchanged at grocery stores, in the way people locked their doors a little earlier at night. For many residents, the horror was not confined to the events of April 2016. It was the slow, drawn-out revelation that a family they'd once greeted at the feed store or seen at the county fair had harbored such lethal intentions. The Rhoden properties, once alive with the comings and goings of children and relatives, now stood quiet. Some of the trailers were dismantled and removed, others left to weather and decay. Weeds grew where gardens once had. and the air that used to carry the sounds of laughter and conversation seemed heavier now, as though the land itself remembered. For law enforcement, the conclusion of the Wagner cases marked the end of an unprecedented investigative effort, but the files they left behind told the true scope of the work. Dozens of bankers' boxes contained interviews, lab reports, ballistic analyses, aerial photographs of the crime scenes, and timelines pieced together from hundreds of data points. Investigators had tracked the Wagners' every move in the months before and after the murders. Text messages about custody, purchases of ammunition, online searches about suppressors, even small talk that took on sinister meaning when viewed in the full context. One detail that emerged from the trove of evidence was how the Wagners had meticulously rehearsed aspects of the killings. Witnesses testified that in the months before April 2016, the family would take long drives in the dark, practicing silent approaches to properties, checking how close they could park without drawing attention, and discussing escape routes. Angela Wagner admitted they had talked about the importance of killing everyone who might fight Jake for custody, her words chilling in their bluntness. The children spared that night became symbols of both tragedy and resilience. Sophia, the center of the custody battle, was placed under the care of her maternal relatives after the arrests. Frankie's son, found wandering near his father's body, grew up in the care of family who tried to give him a semblance of normalcy. The youngest, found in bed beside her dead mother, would never have memories of the night, but would carry its shadow nonetheless. For Sharon Koenig, mother of Hannah Gilley, the loss was compounded by the sheer violence of it. She often spoke publicly about Hannah's warmth, about how she'd loved being a young mother, about the future stolen from her. Other Rhoden relatives shared memories too. Chris Sr.'s skill at fixing engines, Dana's deep loyalty to her family, Kenneth's quiet kindness. In telling these stories, they pushed back against the narrative that the victims were merely names in a headline. The prosecutors themselves admitted that the case had taken a toll. Special Prosecutor Angela Canepa described how emotionally grueling it was to sift through the crime scene photos, to listen to the recordings, to sit across from people describing how they'd methodically ended the lives of a family. Even seasoned investigators admitted to nightmares that in Pike County, the annual remembrance services became a fixture. Each year in April, family, friends, and community members would gather to light candles, read the victims' names aloud, and share stories. The services were quiet, dignified, and heavy with emotion. While the trials had brought legal closure, nothing could undo the absence. The massacre also left a legal legacy. It spurred conversations in Ohio about custody disputes, domestic violence, and the complexities of inter-family conflict in rural areas where law enforcement resources are thin. Some argued that there should be more systems in place to detect and address dangerous custody disputes before they spiraled out of control. Others countered that in this case, the signs, no matter how visible, might never have suggested the scale of violence that was coming. The Wagners' time in prison began without fanfare. Jake settled into his life sentence, occasionally making headlines when journalists revisited the case. George IV and Billy occupied separate cells, their interactions with the outside world limited to legal correspondence and controlled visits. Angela Wagner served her own sentence, knowing that the rest of her life would be spent in a state facility, the four walls a stark contrast to the rolling farmland she once called home. Every so often, reporters returned to Pike County to check in on the story. They'd find the Rhoden family still marked by grief, the Wagners still reviled in public opinion, and the community still grappling with the fact that such a calculated atrocity had been born from something as seemingly ordinary as a custody battle. It was this ordinariness that made the Pike County massacre so haunting. It wasn't the work of strangers or a random burst of violence. It was planned over months, carried out by people whose faces were familiar, whose names were once spoken at birthday parties and Sunday dinners. And that familiarity had allowed them to move so easily in the darkness on that April night, straight into the bedrooms of those they intended to kill. Years later, some residents still avoided talking about it, not out of denial, but because the details felt too heavy to carry. In casual conversation, the massacre had become a scar in the county's collective memory, one that might fade at the edges over time, but would never truly heal. The files are closed now, the trial's complete, the sentences handed down. Yet in Pike County, Ohio, the story of the Rhodens and the Wagners will be told for generations, not just as a true crime case, but as a cautionary tale of how fear, control, and obsession can twist the bonds of family into something unrecognizable, something deadly. The courtroom phase of the Pike County Massacre trials revealed layer after layer of darkness, and each witness brought a new fragment of understanding into how something so unthinkable could unfold in a small rural county where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The most pivotal testimony came from the defendants themselves, particularly Jake and Angela Wagner, whose decision to cooperate with prosecutors became the linchpin of the state's case. Jake's demeanor during cross-examination was striking, flat, emotionless, and precise. When defense attorneys asked him to clarify details, he responded with the same calm cadence he had when describing how he'd ended a life. That unnerved, even seasoned court watchers. There was no sign of hesitation, no crack in his composure, just a cold accounting of what he had done and why he admitted that the idea of killing the Rhodens had started as just talk between him and his mother, but eventually evolved into a mission that consumed the entire Wagner family. In his account, Angela was the strategist, George IV was the enforcer who would handle certain targets, and Billy was the one who could get things done without leaving traces. Jake positioned himself as the one with the most direct motive, regaining control over Sophia's life. Angela Wagner's testimony, in contrast, had a calculated vulnerability. She spoke about being a mother, about wanting to protect her family, about fearing the Rhodens would corrupt Sophia's upbringing. Yet when prosecutors pressed her on why that fear justified taking 8 lives, including people with no direct bearing on the custody case, her voice wavered, but her explanations were chilling. She claimed they believed the Rhodens as a whole would unite against Jake in any legal battle, and that leaving even one adult alive could jeopardize their plans. Forensic experts also took the stand, walking jurors through the painstaking evidence collection. They described the ballistic matches between the recovered bullets and the Wagner firearms, the tool marks on suppressors that could only have come from the Wagners' homemade devices, and the digital breadcrumbs left by internet searches. One particularly damning point was the discovery of online orders for parts that could be used to build silencers. Orders placed in the months leading up to the killings. The trial wasn't without emotional moments from the prosecution's side. Relatives of the victims gave impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. Dana Rhoden's surviving children spoke about the hole left in their lives, about the ordinary moments they'd never get to share again. A mother's advice, a father's pride, a sibling's laughter. Frankie's friends recounted his dedication. As a father, remembering how he would work long hours and still find time to play with his toddler son. Perhaps the most haunting were the testimonies about the children who survived that night. Witnesses described finding the toddlers in the crime scenes, wandering, crying, confused. The youngest, still lying beside her murdered mother, had been too young to understand what had happened, yet the image of her sleeping in the shadow of death stuck with the first responders forever. Defense attorneys tried to chip away at the state's case by suggesting that Jake's and Angela's testimonies were self-serving, that they had painted others in the worst possible light to secure their own plea deals. But the weight of the physical evidence, combined with the consistent details in their accounts, made it nearly impossible to cast significant doubt in the jurors' minds. The psychological angle of the case also became a point of public fascination. Criminal profilers discussed how the Wagners' behavior fit certain patterns seen in family annihilators and controlling personalities. Their willingness to uproot their lives and move to Alaska after the murders was seen as an attempt to sever ties, both physically and emotionally, from the scene of their crimes. But their insular, almost bunker-like family dynamic had already isolated them from most of Pike County long before they ever boarded a plane. After the final sentencing, reporters interviewed jurors who admitted that the sheer scope of the conspiracy weighed heavily on them. Some described sleepless nights during deliberations, haunted by crime scene photos and the knowledge that they were deciding the fate of people who had once been considered neighbors. In the years since, Pike County has tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy, but the massacre remains a reference point in local conversation. Newcomers to the area often hear the story in hushed tones, told by those who lived through the tension of the unsolved years. Parents still remind their children to lock doors at night, something that was once unheard of in this corner of Ohio. For true crime scholars and law enforcement professionals, the Pike County Massacre has become a case study in methodical, planned mass murder carried out within a family structure. The fact that all four conspirators were related by blood and marriage, and that they managed to operate in such tight coordination, makes it one of the rarest kinds of criminal enterprises. The legacy of the case is not just in its legal conclusion, but in its lasting impact on the families left behind. The surviving children will grow up in the care of relatives, their identities shielded from the public as much as possible. But they will eventually learn the full truth, that the people who took their parents' lives were once considered part of their own extended family. It's a truth that can't be softened, a reality that will follow them no matter how far from Pike County they go. And in that, perhaps, lies the cruelest legacy of all, not just the loss of 8 lives, but the fracturing of an entire extended family tree, cut apart by paranoia, control, and a plan that left no room for mercy. Before the nightmare of April 2016, the Rhodens and Wagners had a history that, on the surface, looked like countless other intertwined families in rural Pike County. They'd shared meals, worked side by side on projects, and even attended the same gatherings. At one time, the relationship between Jake Wagner and Hannah Rhoden seemed like a bond that would keep the two families close for decades. Jake had met Hannah when she was still in her teens. She was vivacious, warm, and deeply rooted in her family, while Jake was quieter, more guarded, but attentive in his own way. When their daughter Sophia was born, it was a cause for celebration across both families. For a time, it seemed like the connection between the Rhodens and Wagners would only deepen, but cracks began to appear early. Friends noticed that Jake had a possessive streak. He was particular about who could be around Sophia, how she was dressed, even what food she ate. Hannah, on the other hand, leaned heavily on the Rhodens for support and wasn't inclined to defer entirely to Jake's way of doing things. She was young, determined, and unwilling to surrender control of her daughter's upbringing. Small disagreements escalated into tense exchanges. There were arguments over visitation schedules, unannounced visits, and the influence of extended family members. While most custody disputes simmer and cool, this one seemed to harden over time. Each perceived slight or challenge deepened the rift. The Wagners, by many accounts, were a tight and insular unit. Angela was the matriarch, deeply protective of her sons, Jake and George IV. Billy was the authoritative father figure, practical and unyielding. To outsiders, they could seem standoffish, but within the family, loyalty was absolute. And to Angela, anyone who stood in the way of Jake's relationship with Sophia was a threat. Even before the murders, there were moments that, in hindsight, took on a darker tone. Hannah confided to friends that she felt watched, that Jake would show up unexpectedly or ask probing questions about her plans. On at least one occasion, she told a confidant she felt like her life was being managed by people she no longer trusted. The Rhodens, for their part, remained open and social. Chris Rhoden Sr. was known for lending a hand to neighbors, whether it was fixing an engine or helping with a home repair. Dana, the matriarch, was fiercely loyal to her children, including Hannah, and had little patience for anyone who tried to control them. It wasn't just about Sophia. There was a sense in the Rhoden household that independence was non-negotiable. In the months before April 2016, there were signs of heightened tension. Family members recalled phone calls that left Hannah shaken. Instances where Jake pressed for more control over Sophia's time with the Rhodens. There were also whispers in the community that the Wagners were unhappy with how Hannah was raising their granddaughter, including who she spent time with. Meanwhile, the Wagners began to make subtle but telling preparations. They purchased new firearms and ammunition, citing hunting season, though some of the weapons were not typical for hunting. They also began acquiring parts for what investigators would later identify as homemade suppressors. Trips to remote areas in the county became more frequent, with family members leaving for hours without clear explanations. Looking back, neighbors remembered how the Wagners' property began to feel more closed off. Outbuildings were kept locked, and the family's movements became more contained. Even their conversations with others seemed guarded. as though they were carrying the weight of a secret they couldn't risk exposing. By early 2016, the custody dispute had calcified into something immovable. Court filings were discussed, but never finalized, with each side bracing for a battle they knew would be long and bitter. What no one outside the Wagner home realized was that the family had already decided the outcome by their own means. Angela later admitted in court that she had begun drafting fake custody documents, intending to present them after the murders to formalize Jake's sole guardianship over Sophia. The Wagners believed that once the Rhoden adults were gone, there would be no one left to contest them. And so, under the cover of ordinary life, school runs, grocery trips, Sunday dinners, the Wagners were finalizing a plan that would erase an entire branch of the Rhoden family tree. To the outside world, nothing seemed overtly alarming. The feud was seen as just another small-town custody fight. But inside the Wagner home, every conversation, every purchase, and every late night drive was moving them closer to a night that would forever change Pike County. In the days leading up to April 21st, 2016, Pike County moved at its usual slow pace, with spring settling in and fields beginning to green. But inside the Wagner household, time felt compressed. Every detail of the plan had been discussed, rehearsed, and refined until there was no room for improvisation. They had chosen their date deliberately, a Thursday night rolling into Friday morning, because they believed the Rhodens would be asleep early and the weekend would allow them a window before anyone raised the alarm. Angela spent those days quietly making final arrangements. She ensured the children in their household were settled and would be cared for during the hours they were gone. She checked over the weapons, made sure the suppressors fit, and reviewed the handwritten notes she and Jake had made about which family members to target and in what order. Jake and George IV were tasked with the first location, the home of Chris Rhoden Sr. and Gary Rhoden. Chris Sr. was the patriarch of the Rhoden family, and eliminating him first was part of their strategy, removing the man they saw as a natural protector for the rest of the family. Billy and Angela would handle Dana's residence, and then they would converge on the other two locations, Frankie's trailer, where Hannah Gilly was staying with their toddler son, and Kenneth Rhoden's home, where they intended to make the final kill. Late on the evening of April 21st, they dressed in dark clothing, loaded their weapons, and slipped into the night. Jake later testified that they spoke very little during the drive, the quiet broken only by the hum of tires on the rural roads and the occasional check to ensure no vehicles were following them. Their familiarity with the backroads of Pike County meant they could navigate without headlights in some stretches, further shrouding their movements. At Chris Sr.'s home, they parked in a spot they had pre-selected during earlier surveillance runs. Jake and George moved quickly, entering through an unlocked door. Chris Sr. was asleep in bed when they approached, their silencers muting the shots to dull pops. Gary Rhoden was found in another room, similarly killed before he could react. In less than a few minutes, the two men who anchored the Rhoden family were gone. Billy and Angela, meanwhile, reached Dana Rhoden's home. She was sleeping when Billy entered. Angela's role here was to watch for movement, to ensure no one escaped. Dana was shot multiple times in her bed, her body discovered later with her hand positioned as though she'd stirred in the final second of her life. The Wagners moved on swiftly. Time was their greatest asset, and hesitation could ruin everything. At Frankie's trailer, the violence intensified. Frankie, only 20 years old, was asleep beside his fiancée, Hannah Gilly. Their toddler son was in a nearby room. Jake entered first, shooting Frankie where he lay. Hannah, startled awake, had no time to cry out before she was shot as well. In the next room, the toddler stirred but was left unharmed, a decision the Wagners later described as deliberate to avoid killing children. Finally, they drove to Kenneth Rhoden's home. Kenneth was Chris Sr.'s older brother, known for his kindness and mechanical skills. He was asleep when Billy entered. A single gunshot ended his life, and with it, the final phase of the massacre was complete. By dawn, 8 members of the Rhoden family were dead in 4 separate homes. The killers returned to their own property, discarded clothing, and set about establishing alibis. Angela burned some of the clothes in a barrel behind their home. Other items were hidden or destroyed in remote locations. When the first 911 call came later that morning, it was from a relative who had come to check on one of the victims and found the body. Deputies arriving at the first scene thought they were responding to a single homicide. But within hours, the grim reality emerged. Multiple members of the same family had been executed in different locations. Pike County Sheriff Charles Reeder called in the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and soon the largest investigation in the state's history was underway. In the days that followed, the small county was flooded with law enforcement vehicles, crime scene tape, and news vans. Rumors swirled about drug involvement, gang retaliation, and family feuds. Few suspected the Wagners outright. They were questioned early, but their behavior in public was controlled. Even sympathetic, it took more than 2 years of tireless work, collecting over 1,000 pieces of evidence, executing dozens of search warrants, and conducting hundreds of interviews before investigators had enough to bring charges. The turning point came when forensic matches tied the murders to the Wagners' homemade suppressors, and digital evidence revealed meticulous planning in the months before the killings. The arrests in November 2018 shocked Pike County. Jake, George IV, Billy, and Angela were all taken into custody, each charged with 8 counts of aggravated murder. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty for all 4. It was a stunning conclusion to a mystery that had haunted the county for over 2 years. The trials and plea deals that followed revealed the truth in harrowing detail. Jake's confession confirmed the calculated nature of the killings and the central role of the custody dispute over Sophia. Angela's testimony laid bare the months of preparation. George IV and Billy maintained their innocence to varying degrees, but the jury saw through their defenses. By the end of 2023, every member of the Wagner family involved in the murders had been convicted and sentenced. Life without parole for George IV and Billy, lengthy terms for Angela, and 8 consecutive life sentences for Jake. The surviving Rhoden children were placed with relatives, their identities shielded from the media. The Pike County Massacre remains one of the most shocking crimes in Ohio's history, not just for its scale, but for its intimacy. 8 people killed not by strangers, but by those they once considered family. It is a story of control taken to its most violent extreme, of trust betrayed in the deepest way possible, and of a community that will carry the scar for generations.